A widowed doctor sees his late wife's face in a photo at an exhibition, but when he meets the photographer, something unexplainable happens. Leave your like to support our channel. Thank you. The clock struck 5:42 when Clara Sampaio opened her eyes for the first time that Monday. The sound of twigs scratching the window of her dimly lit apartment seemed to repeat the mantra that the city was still whispering, "Wake up." There was no alarm clock. There was no external noise calling her. It was just the usual weight of anxiety that made her wake up before dawn. The room smelled of wet wood and old photographs. There were still boxes stacked in the corners. The makeshift mattress on the floor left marks on her pale skin. With her body wrapped in an old sweatshirt and her mind in turmoil, she took a deep breath, as if she needed to convince herself that this day, unlike any other, would bring something new. On the wall, stuck with masking tape, was a single photo. A child smiling next to a woman with brown hair and deep-set eyes. "We need to record what can't be said," said her mother, the woman in the photo, who had died when Clara was 14. On the other side of town, in an apartment with high ceilings and silent walls, Dr. Miguel Andrade had already finished his first morning run. He avoided gyms. He preferred the still cold asphalt of the early morning, where the only sound was his own rhythmic strides and his breath trying not to give up. After the run, the ritual, cold shower, strong coffee, a quick read of 2 printed newspapers, the smell of paper still damp from ink, the crackle of pages being turned over. These were habits that reconnected him to the time before the void, before the absence of Helena, his wife, before the house seemed like an echo of itself. At 42, Miguel was respected in the hospital where he coordinated the neurosurgery department. His clinical precision was comparable to that of a Swiss watchmaker, and his eyes, almost black-brown, were famous among the residents for seeing mistakes before they even happened. But his eyes also carried the weight of someone who has loved a lot and lost everything irretrievably. That morning at the Galileo Cultural Center, where a new group exhibition was to begin, Clara was nervously adjusting her old Canon camera. Her work had been selected from dozens. A black-and-white essay called Vestiges of Voice. Each photo revealed small forgotten details. A button dropped on the floor, a cracked cup, trembling hands holding letters. "You look like you've forgotten how to breathe," commented Olivia, the show's curator, as she checked the arrangement of the pictures. Clara gave a half-smile. "Maybe I'm just trying to remember how to breathe." Olivia laughed, but her attentive eyes noticed the tension in the young woman's shoulders. Over time, she had learned to recognize artists who created from pain. At 9:10 a.m., Miguel entered the gallery hall. He wasn't a man who frequented exhibitions, but he had been invited by a neurologist friend who supported the project. He had come as a courtesy, but the atmosphere surprised him. The soft smell of waxed wood, the white walls highlighting the intensity of the photos, and the light sound of a piano in the background transported him to a more serene place, more suspended in time. When he stopped in front of one of the photographs, a wrinkled hand holding a ribbon bow, he felt a knot in his chest. It was the same ribbon that Helena wore in her hair on Sunday afternoons. "Is this your picture?" he asked, almost in a whisper, when he noticed Clara approaching with her ID badge hanging from her neck. She hesitated for a second. "Yes, it's mine. Esperas," she said, referring to the name of the photo. "It smells of absence," Miguel murmured. Clara looked at him in surprise. Few understood what she was trying to convey. Most just said that her photos were beautiful, but that man, there was something in his eyes, as if he also carried silences. "It was taken in natural light in the late afternoon," she explained, trying to keep her voice steady. "Silence was the main character. Absence always is," he replied, before slowly turning to the next image. And then, silence. But not the uncomfortable silence, not the forced pauses. It was a silence full of presence, like a cord suspended in the air, waiting for the next sound. Clara watched Miguel walk away down the hall and felt the world spin a little differently. There was something about him, the way he looked at time, that seemed familiar. That night in her kitchenette, Clara revisited the photos of the day in her mind. She tried to understand why that brief conversation had touched her so much. She didn't even know his name, she only remembered his eyes. Meanwhile, Miguel, sitting in his old leather armchair, held the exhibition folder between his fingers. One name stood out: Clara Sampaio, that image, that hand holding the ribbon, was more than art. It was a memory that bled inside. The following week, Clara was invited to photograph a campaign for the hospital where Miguel worked. It was a social project with cancer patients. She hesitated. It was out of her comfort zone. But there was something about the proposal, perhaps the desire to meet those eyes again. And when she entered the pediatric ward, camera slung over her shoulder, there he was, white coat. Name on the badge, Dr. Miguel Andrade. Their eyes met. There was no surprise, just a kind of recognition. Too much light can blind you, he said, pointing to the windows in the room. But without it, you can only live in the dark, she replied instinctively. He smiled, and at that moment, between laughing children and machines beeping softly in the background, a story began, written in the rhythm of silence. The smell of antiseptic mixed with that of freshly brewed coffee permeated the corridor of the pediatric ward that Tuesday afternoon. Clara adjusted the scarf tied around her neck, an almost automatic gesture she used to hide her anxiety. She carried the camera in her hands as if it were an extension of her own body, but that day it weighed differently. She knew Miguel would be close by. The muffled sound of footsteps, the echo of children's voices, and the dragging of the wheels of a medicine trolley made up the hospital's daily symphony. Even so, Clara seemed to hear only the irregular rhythm of her own heart. When he appeared at the end of the corridor, she felt as if something inside her stopped breathing. Miguel walked with the quiet elegance of someone accustomed to the weight of authority, but there was something in his expression that day, a subtle shadow, perhaps a trace of weariness hidden beneath the rigidity of his lab coat. His eyes met hers briefly, and that was enough for her to know. He recognized her, and he remembered. In the activity room, Clara began to record the scenes. A hairless girl offering beaded bracelets to the doctors, a boy laughing as he blew soap bubbles, a pale teenager painting a volunteer's face with gouache paint. But between one click and another, it was hard not to notice when Miguel passed by, when he approached without saying anything, just with the faint scent of sandalwood that his skin carried. During a break, she found him alone in the inner garden, sitting on a wooden bench under the shade of a broad-leaved tree. His hands rested on his knees, but his fingers moved as if they were playing an invisible piano. Clara approached in silence, hesitating. "Can I sit down?" "Yes, it's less noisy in here than in the corridors." She smiled, not knowing if this was an invitation to talk or a warning not to talk too much. "This tree looks like it's holding up the sky with its arms," she said after a few seconds. Miguel looked at the leaves that danced gently in the wind. "My grandfather used to say that trees are the memory of the earth. They are always listening. We just don't learn to listen." "I'd love to listen to a tree," she murmured, watching the branches. He looked at her then with dark eyes that always seemed to be searching for some truth within the others. "And what would you photograph now if you could?" Clara didn't answer straight away. She looked at his hands, long and firm, with small calluses on the index fingers. "Your hands," she said at last. "They have something to say, but nobody pays attention." Miguel smiled, but his smile looked more like a reflection of sadness than joy. "They've held pulsating brains. They've relieved invisible pain. But they no longer know how to touch someone lightly." Clara swallowed. There was a pain there that no lens would be able to capture in its entirety. "Do you miss touching?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. He closed his eyes for a moment. The wind moved the sleeve of his lab coat slightly. "Touching, yes. But more than that, I miss being touched, by something other than pain or responsibility." She didn't say anything. She just felt her throat burn with the sincerity of it. It was as if his words had penetrated a place inside her where no one had ever reached before. The silence between the two of them lasted longer than any conversation, and yet it said more. That evening, Clara returned home without being able to edit any of the images she had taken. The photos seemed less important than the silences she had shared with Miguel. She sat on the floor of the kitchenette, hugging a pillow, while she listened to the rain falling in uncontrolled drops on the roof tiles. She remembered her mother, the soft voice that always said, "Don't trust beginnings too much, child. They hide more than they show." Meanwhile, Miguel watched the ceiling from his bedroom in his silent apartment. He had turned off all the electronics. The only light came from an amber dome lamp that cast soft shadows on the walls. He thought of Clara, her voice, her questions that weren't invasive but inevitable. It was as if she knew where to look without hurting. The following week, their closeness became inevitable. Miguel began to search Clara with his eyes every time he entered a room. She, in turn, found herself studying his details, the way he smoothed his sleeves before examining a patient, the way he pressed his lips together when something bothered him, and, above all, how he always seemed to contain something that didn't dare to come out. One cloudy afternoon, Clara found him in the cafeteria, sitting alone in front of an almost untouched tray. She approached him without saying a word and just sat down in front of him, putting her glass of tea down on the table. "Do you hate soup too?" she asked, pointing to the full bowl. "No, I'm just not hungry." "And what are you thirsty for?" Miguel looked up, surprised by the unexpected question. "Peace, but not that peace that comes from silence. Peace that comes from a place where you can exist without having to hide. Like in a portrait without a pose," she added. He nodded slightly. "You seem to see what others don't. And you seem to hide what others don't dare to feel." The time between them began to lengthen. They began to meet, not only at the hospital, but also outside it. An afternoon at the planetarium, a quick coffee after an exhibition, a quiet stroll through the second-hand book market. Nothing was called a meeting, but everything had the intensity of one, and the long looks were beginning to carry more weight than they were both willing to admit. One Sunday, Clara invited him to visit her small studio, a makeshift room at the back of an old bookshop. It smelled of old paper, photographic resin, and nostalgic dust. She led him to the back, where walls covered in photos told fragments of stories. "Why do you only photograph what is about to disappear?" Miguel asked, walking slowly in front of the images. "Because what remains doesn't need me," she replied. "I like to keep what time tries to erase." "And you?" He turned to her. "Who keeps you?" Clara hesitated. The question had hit her like an icy breeze. "Nobody, I guess. Maybe these walls." Miguel moved closer, so close that she could feel his breath touch her face. "Can I keep you for a while?" he murmured. She closed her eyes as if that would help her keep her balance. "Only if you promise not to forget me afterwards. I'm not good at promising what I can't control." "Then just stay. For now." He did. And in that instant, there was no need for touch. There was something in both of their eyes, a vulnerability that only those who have lost so much can carry. That was enough. That evening, back in his own apartment, Miguel opened a drawer he hadn't touched for years. He took out a music box that Helena loved. As he turned the crank, a delicate melody filled the room. His eyes filled with water. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was betraying his wife's memory by thinking about another woman. He just felt that there was space, new space, alive, real. Clara, for her part, looked out of the kitchenette window. The city breathed with pale lights in the distance. She touched her lips with her fingers, as if trying to keep the unspoken words of the day there. She knew something was brewing, but she also knew, with the intuition of someone who had lost too much, that love wasn't just about encounters. It was also about having the courage not to run away. The air that Wednesday morning seemed thicker than usual. A soft mist covered the tall buildings, dissolving their shapes into blurred outlines, as if the city didn't want to be remembered. Clara walked slowly along the damp sidewalks of the old neighborhood where she lived. Her sneakers absorbed the cold water dripping from the leaves, and the smell of wet earth seemed to rise up her legs and lodge in her chest. He had slept badly. The last few weeks had been intense. The meetings with Miguel, although discreet, carried a new strength that she couldn't name. It was unlike anything she had ever felt. There was beauty, yes, but there was also a kind of vertigo, like standing on the edge of a cliff with the wind in your hair and your eyes closed. That same morning, Miguel was examining a child in the emergency department when he received the message. It wasn't from Clara or anyone else at the hospital. It was from a number he didn't immediately recognize. Just 3 words. "I need to see you." For a moment, the sound around him seemed to disappear. He stared at the cell phone screen as if the letters could rearrange themselves and say something else. But they didn't. Helena had a sister, Julia. They were close, almost like spiritual twins. After his wife's death, Miguel avoided any contact. It was a way of silencing the past. But now, after more than 2 years, That message hit him like a forgotten echo of something he thought was buried. In the late afternoon, the two met in a cafe tucked away in a discreet lane, where the fogged-up windows offered anonymity. Julia looked different. Her hair was darker, her eyes more tired, but she still had the same calm intensity that Helena carried. "I thought you'd never speak to me again," she said, wrapping her thin fingers around the hot cup. Miguel didn't reply immediately. He watched the smoke rise in spirals, as if there was an answer there. "What happened?" "I saw a photo of you. On the internet, at an exhibition. You were standing next to a photographer. Clara. Your name was in the credits. Her hands are the same as Helena's." Miguel felt a chill in his stomach. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean that you're falling in love with someone, Miguel. And maybe you're pretending you're not. But you are." The sincerity of the sentence cut him clean. He tried to disguise it by adjusting the watch on his wrist, but the slight tremor in his fingers betrayed him. "I didn't come here for you to judge me," he said, more harshly than he had intended. "I'm not judging you. I just think it's time for you to decide whether you're going to continue living with one foot in yesterday, or if you're going to allow the now to embrace you." He looked away. There was guilt, but there was also fear. To love again was to accept the possibility of losing everything, again. Meanwhile, Clara was finishing putting together a new exhibition in a cultural shed in the East Zone. Her hands were covered in black paint from a frame she had hastily refurbished, and her hair smelled of varnish. She was trying to concentrate on her work, but the absence of any messages from Miguel in the last 24 hours was worrying her. It was subtle, an emptiness that didn't hurt, but rubbed against her skin like thin paper. Later, when they finally saw each other, there was a different kind of silence between them. Not the comfortable kind, but the kind that carries questions hanging in the air. "Is everything all right?" Clara asked, watching him with attentive eyes as he absent-mindedly examined one of the photos on display. Miguel hesitated before answering. "Yes, I'm just a bit out of it today." "Out of your mind? Or in too deep?" she asked. He stared at her with a mixture of surprise and recognition. Clara had this gift of saying the right words without seeming to intrude. "I saw someone from my past. It touched me more than I expected." She nodded silently, respecting the space but feeling slightly excluded. As much as she didn't demand explanations, it was hard to accept closed doors when she had already gone through so many windows with him. That night, Clara dreamt of waves crashing against rocks. In the dream, she tried to photograph the sea, but the lens was blurred. When she woke up, her pillow was damp with tears she didn't remember crying. In the days that followed, the distance between them grew without words. It wasn't a physical absence. They continued to see each other, but the touches diminished. The glances took less time. Laughter became rare, until one rainy Friday night, Clara showed up at Miguel's apartment by surprise. It took him a while to open the door. When he finally did, his eyes were red and his voice choked. "I didn't know if I should come," she said, still standing in the doorway, smelling the wine in the air and something else, incense burning, perhaps sandalwood and cedar. "But you came," he replied, "because I don't know if I can go on pretending that everything is the same." He stepped aside, allowing her to enter. The apartment was dark, except for the soft light from the lamp in the corner of the living room. There were books stacked on the sofa, and an open bottle of wine on the coffee table. Miguel walked over to the window and stood with his back to it. "I don't know how to do this," he began, his voice trembling. "I never gave myself the right to feel again. And now you come along with this calm of yours that takes me apart, with these silences that fill me more than any conversation." Clara approached slowly, feeling the soft carpet under her bare feet. "I'm not her, Miguel. I know that. Then don't make me pay for what can no longer be cured." He turned away. His eyes shone in the diffused light. There was something in him that broke and put itself back together at the same time. "I'm afraid. So am I. But fear is just love's way of asking if you have the courage to stay." For a moment he watched her as if seeing her for the first time. Then he moved closer and leaned his forehead against hers. The warmth of their bodies, the smell of the wine, the sound of the rain against the glass, everything formed a kind of cocoon, a place outside of time. "Stay, Clara, even if I still don't know how to love you the right way. Stay until I learn." She hugged him then. Not like someone expecting something, but like someone welcoming. And in that embrace, with no promises, no guarantees, something settled between them. The choice to try, even if it was in pieces. Mornings began to change after that rainy Friday, not in a spectacular way, but like the light that gradually comes through the gaps in the shutters, announcing the day without a fuss. Clara woke up with the feeling that something inside her had been rearranged. The most banal details, the smell of freshly brewed coffee, the texture of the linen blanket, the sound of the city slowly waking up, seemed to take on a new shape, as if life had finally taken on a new focus. Miguel, for his part, felt his body less rigid in the morning. There was still the weight of routine, the echo of absence, but now Clara inhabited his thoughts in a subtle and constant way. What had once been emptiness became waiting, and waiting, he discovered, was a way of continuing to love without invading. Little by little, the two of them learned to share small spaces of intimacy. An impromptu dinner on the living room floor, muffled laughter in a bookstore on sale, hands intertwined under the table of a discreet restaurant. But there were also the first cracks, and not for lack of affection, but for too much of the past. The third time she slept at Miguel's house, Clara woke up startled in the middle of the night. Cold sweat trickled down her temples, and her breathing came in short gasps. The room was silent, except for the sound of the air conditioning humming in the background. She sat up in bed, trying to remember the dream. It was always the same. Her mother in hospital, the machine beeping, his cold hand holding hers until it stopped. Miguel woke up at the movement. He sat down next to her, running his hand slowly over her back. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice still hoarse from sleep. "Just a bad dream," she replied. "It's over now." But it's not over. It stayed, like a smell that permeates the skin. The next morning, Clara left without saying goodbye. She left a note. "I needed some air. We'll talk." Miguel felt his stomach turn, not because of the note itself, but because of what it didn't say. He knew how to recognize the flight of someone carrying an old pain. She spent the whole day walking around the city aimlessly. She went into churches, vinyl stores, bookstores, and cafes. She wrote loose phrases in a blue notebook that she always carried with her. On one page he wrote, "Love scares me because it makes me want to stay." On another, "What if I become absence again? What if I don't know how to be present without losing myself?" In the evening, when she finally returned home, she found a bag hanging from the doorknob. Inside was a book of poems by Sophia de Mello Breiner Andresen and a handwritten note from Miguel. "You don't have to explain yourself. Just don't close the door. Love knows how to wait, but it needs a place to sit," Clara cried. Not from sadness. It was a different kind of cry, the kind that comes when the soul feels recognized. Over the next few days, they saw each other again, with more silence between meetings but also more presence during them. Miguel began to realize that there was a fragility in Clara that wasn't weakness. It was resistance, like branches that bend in the wind but don't break. One evening, while they were having dinner in her small apartment, Miguel noticed the photographs taped to the wall. Among the old portraits and new pictures, there was one that caught his eye. A thin woman with deep-set eyes and a tired smile. She was sitting in a wheelchair holding a book. "That was my mother," Clara said, noticing his gaze. Miguel approached slowly. "She seems loved a lot." She did. Even when she didn't have the strength to speak, she looked at me as if she wanted to remind me who I was. "And who were you?" Clara was slow to answer. She lowered her gaze. She touched the frame of the photo with her fingertips. A girl who was afraid that love would always be followed by loss. Miguel approached and held her hand firmly. "I was afraid too. I still am. But sometimes it's fear that shows us where love lives." She leaned her head against his chest. Miguel's heart beat loudly but rhythmically. Like an old song, like a beacon. The time between them began to lengthen. They slept together more often. They shared brushes, pillows, recipes, and childhood stories. But the intimacy also brought discomfort. One afternoon, Clara was irritated by the way Miguel walked away after a banal discussion about work. He would remain silent for hours, as if he would rather swallow his anger than confront her. "You can't disappear just because something bothers you," she said, her voice breaking. "It's not disappearing, it's trying not to hurt." "But silence hurts too." Miguel sighed, running his hand through his hair. He walked over to the window and stood there, watching the cars go by. "Sometimes I still talk to her," he said after a while. "With whom?" "Helena. Not out loud. But here," he pointed to his head, "I say things I didn't say. I apologize for things I didn't understand. Sometimes I think she still listens to me." Clara approached him slowly. She stood next to him but without touching him. "And do you think she'd ask you to shut up about who's alive?" Miguel closed his eyes. Her scent, a mixture of flowers and photographic ink, invaded his senses. It was there in that smell that he wanted to live. Perhaps she was saying live, even if it hurts. Live, even if love now has another name. She put her hand on his shoulder. "I don't want to be a substitute. I want to be a choice." And it is. That night, they made love as if they were starting over. There was no urgency. It was the slow touch of someone who recognizes each scar before kissing it. His hands traced paths across her skin like someone drawing maps so as never to get lost again. And Clara finally felt whole. For the first time in a long time, she felt she wasn't waiting to be abandoned. At dawn, still entwined under the crumpled sheets, Clara talked about her father. About how he had disappeared when she was 9, how he took the car, the money, and left only a short letter on the kitchen table. "I'm sorry. I don't know how to be a father." Miguel listened to her in silence, his fingers caressing her shoulders. "I spent years wondering what it was in me that made people leave. And did you find out? That it's not me. It's them. People's fear of love is stronger than their desire to stay. I'm not leaving." She didn't answer. But her silence that morning was the closest thing to an "I believe" I'd ever given. Autumn arrived without warning. The wind began to blow drier in the afternoons, and the reddish leaves danced on the sidewalks like loose, aimless memories. Clara felt her body respond to the change of season in subtle ways: deeper sleep, colder fingers, a more attentive heart. It was as if something was getting ready to happen, even if she didn't yet know what. Miguel had changed too. Not in the way he walked or the way he smiled, but in the absence of resistance. Now when she approached, he didn't hide. When he felt afraid, he said so. When he felt love, he let it overflow, even if in a restrained way. He was like a tree that had learned to bend its branches without breaking them. On the last Friday of the month, Miguel was called in for emergency surgery. A 13-year-old boy with an aggressive brain tumor needed immediate intervention. He spent more than 10 hours in the operating room, fighting against time and the tight margins between life and the absence of it. When he finished, exhausted, he knew he had succeeded. The boy would live. But there, amid the sweat and blood, a sudden twinge in his left eye made him shudder. He didn't say anything to anyone. He put it down to tiredness. He returned home with stiff muscles and a faint ringing in his ear. That evening, Clara was waiting for him with hot soup, freshly baked cheese bread, and a lighted candle on the table. The scent of rosemary floated in the air like an ancient care. Miguel smiled at the sight of her and hid the tremor he felt as he leaned back in his chair. Over dinner, they talked about everything and nothing. Clara showed him photos of the new series she was preparing, this time about windows. Miguel commented that every window was, in fact, a choice, to look in or to look out. She agreed, but added, "Some windows become mirrors if you get too close." Over the next few days, the ringing returned, and along with it, the vertigo. Miguel began to forget words and change names. One day, while trying to write a prescription, he froze. The pen trembled between his fingers, and the letter came out shaky. He resigned temporarily and secretly booked an MRI scan. Clara noticed the change but didn't press him. She started visiting him more often, bringing him fresh flowers on Sundays and observing his silences with more attentive eyes. Until, one late afternoon, he handed her an envelope. Inside was a medical report and a single handwritten sentence: "I don't want to lie to you." Clara read it, sitting on the sofa. The paper trembled in her hands. Glial tumor. Low aggressiveness, but sensitive position. Left temporal lobe region. Risk of memory and speech loss. "How long did you know?" she asked, her voice low. 3 weeks ago. "And why now?" "Because I don't want you to stay out of pity. I want you to stay out of love. Or go, if you need to." She was silent for a long time. The smell of the coffee she had made earlier still hung in the air, mixed with the scent of lavender in the room. The ticking of the wall clock seemed louder in that room where you could hardly breathe. "Are you giving me the choice?" "Yes, I am." "Then listen carefully," she said, her voice firm. "I choose to stay, not because I'm strong, but because to love is to keep going even when the ground shakes. I know what it's like to lose, and I also know what it's like to gain someone who becomes home, and you, Miguel, are my home." He came closer, his eyes watering, and hugged her. He felt her body mold to his as if that was the right place. There was nothing more to prove. Just live, with the beauty and pain that each day would bring. They started going to their appointments together. Clara accompanied him like someone holding a candle in a dark tunnel. Miguel, for his part, began to record his memories in small notebooks. He wrote about the places he knew, the books he loved, the sounds that marked his childhood. He called them maps for when I forget. Clara photographed his gestures, his hands writing, his profile at the window, his crooked smile when he forgot the name of an actor. Everything was a living memory, and she understood more than ever that time was the only author who wrote with pencil and eraser at the same time. One day, sitting under a fig tree in a remote park, Miguel asked, "What if I forget who you are? Then I'll remind you, with my photos, with my smell, with the sound of my voice telling you your name, with the scars that time has left in your eyes. Because you don't need to remember me with your mind. It's enough for the heart to recognize," he cried, not from fear, but of gratitude. The love she offered him was more than presence. It was a commitment to permanence. The following spring, the tumor receded. Surgery, until then inadvisable, became feasible. Miguel decided to operate. It was risky, but he wanted more time, more springs with her, more Sundays with the scent of rosemary. Before entering the operating room, he asked Clara to put one of his favorite photos on the bedside table in the hospital room, the image of a lady's hands holding a blue ribbon. It was the picture that had made him notice Clara for the first time. "That picture saved me," he said. "May it bring me back." Clara kissed his forehead with the gentleness of one who blesses. Then she waited, for hours, without getting up from the chair, her hands clasped in her lap, her heart squeezed between fear and hope. Miguel survived, and he came back, slower, more fragile, but whole, with a slightly blurred memory. Yes, but with his love intact. Months later, on a honey-colored evening, the two of them were walking through an antiques fair when Miguel turned to her and said, "You know, sometimes I forget how we met, but I never forget how you make me feel." She smiled, squeezing his hand. "And how do I make you feel?" "Like someone who remembers something important without knowing what it is, but you feel that it's enough to go on living." That day, he bought a simple, aged silver ring, and right there, under the shade of a tree and the smell of baking bread coming from the stall next door, he knelt down in front of her. "I don't want to promise eternity, Clara, but I want to promise you every day that I remember. And on the days I forget, I want to promise you that my soul will still recognize you." She accepted, not with tears, but with a light laugh that danced like leaves in the wind. It was the perfect response to a story that never sought to be perfect, just real. Time, after all, doesn't take everything away, it also leaves, and what remains is what matters. So what did you think of this story? Tell me in the comments, I really want to know. If you liked it, leave a like, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories, and check out the story that's appearing on your screen now.